So CPAC 2014 effectively over, and we had fun throughout the last week on the Young Turks, analyzing some of the crazy things that were said, the ridiculous panels that they had, things like the LaPierre speech, the diversity panel that was a complete flop and all that. But one of the biggest things each year at CPAC that conservatives at least, and Republicans in the media pay a lot of attention to, is the CPAC straw poll. That straw poll now done, and it could perhaps give an indication of who the front runner will be in the next presidential election. I think in this case it's probably not going to come true, but let's take a look at the results anyway. Leading the way with 31% of the vote, Rand Paul. Now, obviously, mainstream Republicans aren't going to be as popular at something like CPAC. Someone like a libertarian like Rand Paul, going to be very popular. Won't be surprised to find out with 11% of the vote in second place, Ted Cruz. And then you have Chris Christie at like 9%, and it goes down from there. You see Ben Carson on the list of the front runners, I suppose. And so this really isn't that surprising to anyone. Rand Paul, very popular among conservatives because of his positions on things like the economy, but also drone strikes. Some Republicans, the base anyway, not as excited about getting involved in more foreign wars, and so someone like Rand Paul is going to be pretty popular in that regard. But lest you believe that, like, oh, well, you know, I've liked a few things Rand Paul has said. Maybe he wouldn't be a bad guy to run for president. We're going to go back over a couple of the crazier things that he has said that either should lead liberals to oppose him or in some cases might make Republicans actually dislike him. I like some of these quotes. Let's see how you respond to them. First quote, now this is on healthcare. This is back in 2009. He was at a Kentucky healthcare town hall meeting. And he said, if you think you have the right to healthcare, you are saying basically that I am your slave. I provide healthcare. My staff and technicians provide it. If you have a right to healthcare, then you have a right to their labor. And look, I just think, and this is something that I say all the time with the Young Turks, that if this is your view of social services being given to people, then you just live in a different America than I do. I think that we have a certain responsibility to people, a certain responsibility especially to people on the bottom, the lowest rung of the American ladder of opportunity, and I think that providing healthcare is a part of that. And that does not mean that we pay 100% coming from taxes or anything like that. We're nowhere near that. But the idea that we're going to expand access to healthcare is slavery, I think it's going to be hard to sell that message to the public, especially as more parts of Obamacare go into effect and people realize that they're not absolutely insane. Next one, this is on racial discrimination by businesses. You've probably heard this quote before, but I want you to think about it again. An interviewer says, would you have voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964? And Paul responds, I like the Civil Rights Act in the sense that it ended discrimination in all public domains, and I'm all in favor of that. And then the interviewer says, but... And Rand Paul says, you had to ask me the but. I don't like the idea of telling private business owners, I abhor racism. It's the bad, he cuts himself off. I think it's the bad business decision to exclude anyone from your restaurant. But at the same time, I do believe in private ownership. You can't have businesses saying, I'm not going to allow racial minorities in. I'm not going to allow gay Americans in, something like that. Religious minorities, for instance. You could certainly imagine that coming up in many states in the U.S., and I understand that perhaps with your like full-throated version of capitalism, that seems like it would make sense. But again, that's not the America that I want to live in. I don't think it's the American that most Americans want to live in. And imagine going back a couple decades or 100 years. We wouldn't allow Italians in our businesses. That should be perfectly fine. We won't allow the Irish in, perhaps. We won't allow Jews in. Like, it becomes so ridiculous when you look outside of just the modern day. I personally think it's ridiculous now, too. Rand Paul disagrees, and I think that that is something that is inevitably going to come up if he does run for president again. Third, now this is on church and state. This is pretty interesting. He was talking, this is 2008, he was talking about President Bush's faith-based initiatives program. And he says, churches do charity work, and that is wonderful, but they shouldn't be corrupted with government money. He also said that the initiatives obscure the church-state separation that there really ought to be. Now, I personally love this. I don't think that government should be getting entangled with churches, even to the extent that they already are. I think that the tax-exempt status that they have is incredibly questionable, especially considering the political activity that many churches get up to during election season. I think that the faith-based initiatives are a bad way to go. I think that private charities make a lot more sense in that regard. But I bring up this quote not because I oppose it, but because I have to imagine a lot of the Republican base probably not going to be too thrilled to find out that he's not only in favor of not supporting churches more going forward if he were to be president, but he actually wants to potentially roll back some of the faith-based initiatives programs that the previous President Bush put into effect. Most Republicans aren't going to be a fan of that. Final quote I want to talk about today is on Social Security. Now, understand that this quote is from a while ago, and people evolve, but just bear it in mind. Back in 1998, he was on KET's Kentucky Tonight, and he said, "I think the average American is smart enough to make their own investments. The more freedom, the better. Reform is going to happen, and I hope it's privatization." So that is what, at the very least in 1998, he thought about Social Security. Now, he's made some quotes in years since then, where he seems to indicate that he thinks that we should go towards privatizing part of it, but perhaps not all of it. Now, remember, this is a discussion we were having in the middle part of the last decade. President Bush wanted to move towards privatizing Social Security, and you saw where that got him. That was perhaps the beginning of the end for his presidency, at least in terms of public approval for what he was doing. Now, I assume Rand Paul, he seems like a savvy enough guy that he'll probably backtrack on this quite a bit. But if he starts talking about privatizing Social Security again, especially after how the economy tumbled a couple of years ago, imagine what that would have done to retirees or potential future retirees' investments. It would have been horrible. It would have wreaked an enormous toll on the future prospects of many Americans, and I think that they will be savvy enough to know that that's not a route we need to go down. Now, there are a lot of quotes that Rand Paul has given that either Republicans or Democrats might hate and might make them not want to vote for him in the future. A lot of good things, too. But you have to understand that he is a complete package. He's not just drug legalization or opposing drones. He's a full politician, and you might not like a lot of it the more you find out. And look, I think that the CPAC straw poll that he won is not an indication that he's going to be the Republican nominee in the next election, but he is going to get a lot of media attention because of this, and I don't think he's going to like all the attention.